The Scottish hard rock band Nazareth had all of the makings of a proto-metal band. The raspy scream of their vocalist, the heavy riffs, and more than a couple metal-looking album covers. While they didn't gain the success of such hard rock titans as Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple, is it possible that Nazareth contributed to the evolution of metal more than one might think? Well, let's get into that and more as we explore Nazareth. So my history with this band is practically nil. I think, like many fans of hard rock in my generation, most if not all exposure to Nazareth was done by a single album, such being Hair of the Dog. Bought this album when I was a teenager, additionally grabbed by this amazing cover art, and I know the album decently, but absolutely nothing else about the band, so that's why I'm doing this video. Anyways, let's do a brief history of the band. They were formed in 1968, the year I was born. Like Kiss, it took a few albums to get noticed, but unlike Kiss, much of that happened outside of the United States. The album that broke them in America, as I mentioned, was Hair of the Dog in 1975, featuring the title track, which often gets misnamed by listeners as Son of a Bitch, since that's the hooky chorus line from it. They did gain an extended popularity in Europe after they died off in the United States, but aren't particularly remembered these days by the younger set. Also, all but one original member is dead, the surviving member being bassist Pete Agnew. The most recent member to go was vocalist Dan McCafferty, who died in 2022 at the age of 76. But the band is still around, this time fronted by Carl Sentence, who some of you Nawabum fans might remember as the singer of Persian Risk. So there's a metal connection right there. Anyways, we're going through 10 studio albums here, and I'll have a wrap-up after that with some of my conclusions based on hearing these records, as well as a ranking for all albums mentioned. And just to put some parameters on this, I do know the band started putting out albums in 1971, but I'm only going to cover the releases during their popular period between 1973 to 1981, specifically albums that charted well and were certified, so gold and platinum albums only, which will basically keep this focused. So with that, let's begin. Starting with their third studio album released May 5th, 1973 by A&M Records, this is Razmanaz. So right away with the title track, you get this big guitar sound that could have made an impression upon the Nawabum bands to follow. Shades of a much heavier Zeppelin, but riffs more raucous and aggressive than that, with some up-tempo blues and older rock and roll in parts as well. Maybe think a more forceful version of Aerosmith, especially in the vocals. You'll really hear it in Bad Bad Boy, which sometimes mirrors Aerosmith's rendition of Walk the Dog. For some perspective, Razmanaz, the band's third album, came out the same year as the Aerosmith debut, so maybe Aerosmith got a little something from this band. Maybe. But getting back to the vocals, the singing is screechy but effective, and we also get some prominent bass playing in the mix, which one might expect from a four-piece where the singer plays no instrument. Favorites on this one are Razmanaz, Alcatraz, and Sold My Soul, the last of which has a spooky and definite occult rock vibe that might bring a modern act such as Lucifer to mind, because Lucifer covering this track would be utterly amazing. As for charting and certification, it reached 157 in the US, 11 in the UK, and 39 in Canada. Also in Canada, it was certified platinum. In general, this was the first Nazareth album to break into the charts anywhere, which is clearly why I'm starting with this one. Also, Roger Glover of Deep Purple produced this album, the first of 3 in a row for him and Nazareth. Glover's involvement was likely no accident, as the two bands were on tour together at the time. As for cover tunes, Artillery covered Razmanaz on their 1990 album By Inheritance. Kevin DuBrow covered it on his In for the Kill album from 2004. Arch covered it for their 1991 release of For the Sake of Mankind. Morgana Le Fay covered it on their album Knowing Just As I from 1993. And Saxon covered the title track on their More Inspiration album of cover tunes from 2023. Also, Too Bad, Too Sad from Razmanaz was covered by Raven on their cover tunes EP from 2015 called Party Killers. So I can definitely hear how a lot of those bluesier second wave hair metal bands could have pulled from early Nazareth, but also maybe some of the rowdier Nawabum bands could have focused on the big guitar sound and occasional aggression too. So some cross appeal there for sure. While the album starts heavier with the first 2 tracks, it ends with 2 heavies and a rock ballad. The midsection mostly meanders through blues rock, some moments of psychedelia, and some catchy pop choruses, and so listeners of harder rock and metal might lose steam with it. But when they're heavy in those bookend tracks, they're definitely worth paying attention to. Next is their fourth studio album, released November 9th, 1973 by A&M Records. This is Loud and Proud. So definitely a slicker production, but also an uptick in catchy riffs, somewhat reminiscent of what we'd hear later on early albums from Kiss and AC/DC, while still firmly rooted in the Nazareth sound. However, we're getting a lot of repetition in some of the choruses, with the title of the song sung over and over again, and common for the era, but also lazy songwriting. Not Faking It and Teenage Nervous Breakdown really come to mind in that regard. We are getting some more diversity from track to track over the last album. Some group vocals and choruses that almost remind me of Angel or The Sweet, which is definitely where you're also hearing that increased production the most. Songs seem more realized here as well. Also getting a bit of the gallop riff in This Flight Tonight, so perhaps Iron Maiden were listening to this band. Also, I did have a fleeting recollection of this song, notably while hearing that chorus, but I just can't remember when or in what situation. You also get a ballad called Child in the Sun, in which McCafferty does clean vocals in parts. You might be reminded of Love Hurts a little, but it also has its own identity, to be fair. The group vocals in this particular chorus also have a gospel feel to them, which is kind of interesting. Funny enough, the ending track, The Ballad of Hollis Brown, which actually has the word ballad in it, is considerably heavier with a distorted bass riff and some distant psych guitar passages, adding a bit of darkness to the track. That bass tone in particular might have been attractive to one Cliff Burton, because I'm hearing a pinch of that for sure. This is also a Bob Dylan cover, but you'd almost never know that, as this version is totally made into a Nazareth song. And again, very dark and a bit creepy, but easily the heaviest thing on this record. It's also over 9 minutes long, so get ready for that. We're still getting the blues rock thing throughout the record, notably in the solos and in the vocal delivery. Thought I'd mention that as well. As I mentioned before, Roger Glover produced this album and the next one as well, but he also plays guest bass on this record for the track Freewheeler. Also, favorites: Go Down Fighting, great song, Freewheeler, as I just mentioned, and of course, The Ballad of Hollis Brown. As for charting and certification, it reached 150 in the US, 10 in the UK, 17 in Canada, and number 1 in Austria. The album also went platinum in Canada and gold in Sweden. As for covers, Not Faking It was covered by Michael Monroe on his solo album, Not Faking It, from 1989. Monroe, of course, once lead singer for Finnish hard rock band Hanoi Rocks. It's also not a stretch to say that there is some overlap, sonically speaking, with Nazareth and Hanoi Rocks, perhaps by way of some Rolling Stones influence. Of course, we're still getting similarities with Aerosmith and some occasional Led Zeppelin, but just not as much as the last album. So, was initially excited about there being 3 cover tunes on this album, the other 2 being This Flight Tonight, which was originally done by Joni Mitchell, as well as Teenage Nervous Breakdown, which was originally done by Little Feat. But they sidestepped the predictability of performing them note for note and an emulation of the original, and instead make these tracks totally their own, especially The Ballad of Hollis Brown, which I would highly recommend. Overall, the album is decent, has some definite moments, better than the last album, and that makes me want to hear what's coming next. Also, if interested, both Nazareth and Judas Priest chose to cover female singer-songwriters of the era, which I find kind of interesting. They definitely made the tracks their own, and Roger Glover is the producer of both. Kind of interesting, right? Perhaps not an accident, as Glover encouraged Judas Priest 4 years later to cover Baez, so maybe because he felt it already worked for Nazareth and Mitchell, it might also work for Priest and Baez. Who knows? Next up is their 5th studio album, released in May of 1974 by A&M Records. This is Rampant. So you're immediately hit with loud and fuzzy guitar riffing from the up-tempo Silver Dollar Forger parts 1 and 2, which amps up the heaviness right away. We're getting more of those group vocals from the last album, which makes sense since it seemed to work so well before. Moments of boogie riffing here, notably on Glad That You're Gone. Although we had a little bit of the last record, there's a bit of wah pedal happening on this album as well, which can get a bit 70s porn soundtracky at times. But maybe that's just me. Another ballad here too, this time Loved and Lost, which sounds nothing like the one on the last record, or the one on the next. Very bluesy and mellow, and cleaner vocals with a slight hint of rasp. It's very 70s. Also getting the return of more of that old-timey rock and roll that dominated Razmanaz with the song Shanghaied in Shanghai having a bit of that. Listen carefully and you'll catch a very brief homage to the Rolling Stones at the 2:03 mark. I might have gained some satisfaction from that. Also some slide guitar and parts that wouldn't be out of place on a ZZ Top record. Jet Lag has a cool talk box part along with the aforementioned slide guitar, very cool. Heavy riff as well. Light My Way is an otherwise slow but effective rocker with rather distant and trippy vocals. Sunshine, the second ballad on the record, could have very well influenced Tesla as it's got that sound to it as well. Favorites are Silver Dollar Forger, parts 1 and 2, Light My Way, and Shapes of Things / Space Safari. As for charting and certification, it reached 157 in the US, 13 in the UK, and 80 in Canada. Speaking of which, the album did go gold in Canada. Also, John Lord plays keys on Glad When You're Gone and Shanghaied in Shanghai. I'm guessing Roger Glover set that up. I mean, both of those guys are in Deep Purple, so it makes sense. Anyways, it's got a couple of heavy tracks, but the record is also incredibly unfocused with no need for 2 ballads, let alone throwing in the entire kitchen sink of effects and styles. It's listenable for sure and does have it moments, but just not enough of them. Next is their 6th studio album, released April 3rd, 1975 by A&M Records. This is Hair of the Dog. So the title of this album is in reference to a line in the chorus of the title track. The line, "Now you're messin' with a son of a bitch," is a play on the son of an heir or hair, and a bitch being a dog. So, heir of the dog, son of a bitch. Get it? Anyways, the talk box is back in the title track. Speaking of which, a persistent cowbell brings us into some of that awesome heavy groove riff, and honestly, McCafferty has never sounded better. Guitars are mostly heavier from the last album, maybe because their guitar player produced the record. Let's go with that. And nowhere is that more evident than in the opening riff to Miss Misery, an almost doomy rocker that could easily be covered by a band like Trouble, for example. It does have some chorus repetition, but the music changes up over time in those parts to make it far less monotonous. Love Hurts is next, and perhaps to the surprise of some, it is a cover song, originally done by the Everly Brothers, which I did not know as a kid whatsoever, and wouldn't have picked up on as they once again make a cover their own. And I am convinced that junior high dances across America and elsewhere in the mid-1970s played the utter crap out of this song. I mean, some 12-year-old totally got his heart broken to this right on the dance floor. Anyways, yes, this is a ballad with some almost haunting acoustic work and some seriously soulful vocals from McCafferty. Very cool. Next up is Changin' Times. It brings in more of that heavy groove riffing, leaving more of the bluesiness to McCafferty, which I feel works better and allows more heaviness in the track overall. We also get the Crazy Horse cover Beggar's Day, which is serviceable, followed by the instrumental track Rose in the Heather, which is short. It does meander a little bit, but ultimately it doesn't bug me at all. I'm okay that it's there. Probably the one somewhat disposable track might be Whiskey Drinkin' Woman, and more so for its 5.5-minute runtime. But then we're treated to the album closer, Please Don't Judas Me, a strangely Middle Eastern sounding ballad with McCafferty's vocals a tad distorted and distant, but delivering some seriously good lyrics. Intertwined with this is some occasionally jangly, almost Western acoustic work, which you wouldn't think would work, and then yet it does. It's an epic length at almost 10 minutes, but it has such atmosphere and compelling tone, you almost feel hypnotized by it. Very relaxing, to say the least. Anyways, favorites on this one are Miss Misery, Love Hurts, and Please Don't Judas Me. As for charting and certification, it reached 17 in the US, 20 in Canada, and highest of all in Norway at number 5. In Canada, it also went to gold status, and in the US, it hit platinum. Love Hurts and Hair of the Dog were the singles. As for covers, the title track has been covered by Guns N' Roses on their album The Spaghetti Incident from 1993, as well as by Britney Fox on their Boys in Heat album from 1989. Warrant also covered the title track on their 2001 album Under the Influence, as well as Jizzy Pearl on his 2007 album Just a Boy. The track Miss Misery was covered by Overkill as a bonus track on their White Devil Armory album from 2014. Metallica covered Please Don't Judas Me on their Helping Hands live and acoustic at the Masonic album in 2019, as well as Metal Church covering that same song on their From the Vault compilation album in 2020. But regarding that first cover I mentioned, it's no secret that Axl Rose admired this band and their singer greatly, and you can hear it in Rose's vocals on every GNR album. It's pretty obvious. So almost needless to say, this album just crushes with its 70s rock heaviness and punch, and even the ballads work out, so bonus. The guitar tone on this album in particular would be very much at home in not just heavy metal, but maybe even speed or thrash if you were to turn up the tempo, of course. Next up is their 7th studio album released in March of 1976 by A&M Records. This is Close Enough for Rock and Roll. So the opening track, Telegram, was actually their show opener from the time of this record until at least the early 80s. It's broken up into 4 parts and runs almost 8 minutes, so it's a bit of a long one to open an album with. The first few minutes drag quite a bit, but a heavy riff sneaks in after that, which I would have liked more of, but it's unfortunately in short supply in this track. Getting some interesting guitar harmonies that skitter into Queen territory a little as well. This leads into Vicky, which is an acoustic instrumental that has a slight southern twang to it, but also carries a vibe with it that Dee from Randy Rhoads also has, and which is also named after a girl, incidentally. Homesick again carries some of that southern feel from the instrumental, but doubles down on it for this ballad. We get a lot of ballads from this band, and Love Hurts aside, I'm not sure it's a strength of theirs, but we'll see where the albums go. Moving on to Vancouver Shakedown, the southern vibe persists with this little roadhouse tune, providing lots of slide guitar and a noticeable uptick in energy while still remaining at a mid-pace. Next is Born Under the Wrong Sign, which I can only describe as a dark funk track with cool prominent bass lines, eerie vocals, and guitars switching up between sudden power chords and distant wails. After that, we get Loretta, which brings back the swagger that Aerosmith basically made an entire career off of. But you can also mix in a groove-laden version of late Beatles heaviness, and the band has claimed the Beatles as an influence. Love the solo in this one as well. Anyways, Carry Out Feelings is a mid-paced ballad that almost sounds like a Joe Walsh tune. It's okay. Next is Lift the Lid, which returns to the boogie rock thing they've done before, but has a cool groove in both the instruments as well as in McCafferty's voice. It picks up the flow of the record a little, and does have, again, a kind of ZZ Top vibe to it in parts. And then we end with You're the Violin, a mellow mid-paced rocker with that groove funk thing from before. Digging moments of guitar work here and there, but it doesn't feel like an ender track to me at all. Getting to the album cover image, it was done by the art group known as Hypnosis, who also did some very weird covers for the Scorpions, as well as Pink Floyd, AC/DC, Black Sabbath, and others too. Anyways, favorite tracks in this one are Vancouver Shakedown, Born Under the Wrong Side, and Loretta. As for charting and certification, it reached 24 in the US, 12 in Canada, and highest of all in Sweden at number 9. Also went gold in Canada. So I feel like this album largely hangs out in more mellow territory than the hit record before it. Less moments of heaviness overall, and certainly funkier than previous efforts. It's fine, but not blowing me away. The record still did decently for sales, but I'm wondering if this is another case of people buying a record based on their love of the previous one. I suspect that might be the case for some. Next is their 8th studio album released in November of 1976 by A&M Records. This is Playin' the Game. So a bluesy hard rock number opens the record with Somebody to Roll, which keeps in theme with the band leading with a strong track. It's got a satisfying stomp to it, with McCafferty's vocals getting a bit more punch in them that we hadn't heard much of since Hair of the Dog. The overtracked and chaotic soloing is kind of fun as well. Things slowed down a touch for Down Home Girl, which is probably about 2 minutes too long and a little over 5. Next is Flying, a ballad that slows things down even more, which is an odd choice for a rock album to do this early on. Vocals are strained and the lyrics are cloying at best. The tempo picks up a little with Waiting for the Man, with a bass lead in that almost makes you think this track will go the way of Another One Bites the Dust by Queen, but it doesn't. It is funky though. Also take the lyrics out of this and it's definitely a 70s porn track. Next is Born to Love, with its upbeat riff and pulsating bass beats, as well as some decent soloing. Though I'm reminded at this point that the energy and vibe really needs to pick up some more. This brings us to I Want to Do Everything for You, with a boogie blues bass line similar in tone to AC/DC's Ride On. It's competent and better than much of what we heard, but still sitting in that low tempo pocket. And then we drop to another ballad in I Don't Want to Go On Without You, which starts to feel like we're trying to retread the success of Love Hurts and doing it poorly. Then we get Wild Honey, which is another ballad and a Beach Boys cover to boot. And then I'm woken up with the ender track, LA Girls, which finally steps it up and has an almost commercialized feel of 70s punk to it, but without actually crossing that line. Not quite Ramones, but definitely not, say, the Dead Boys. Anyways, favorites on this one are Born to Love and LA Girls. As for charting and certification, it reached 75 in the US, 14 in Canada, and 14 in Sweden. And yes, it went gold in Canada as well. So a whole lot of mellow and low-tempo numbers that make this record drag a great deal. It's only 40 minutes long, but it's a long 40 minutes. Only 2 songs got my attention, and the rest just fades into the background. Also, 4 cover tunes on a single record is totally ludicrous. Next up is their 9th studio album, released in November of 1977 by A&M Records. This is Expect No Mercy. So a boogie hard rock riff leads us into some energetic vocals in the form of the title track, which has a whole lot of stomp and even a little aggression to it. Love the gang vocals in the chorus, and I'm reminded a little of the punchier side of AC/DC. So far, so good. Next, we got Gone Dead Train, which brings in some blues along with that stomp. Not as strong as the first track, but still very listenable. A little Rolling Stones-ish as well. After this, we got another ballad with Shot Me Down, which brings in that Western flavor they've tapped into before. Not as great as Love Hurts, and you're probably going to hear that a lot, but better than the last so many ballads, to be sure. Next is Revenge is Sweet, and they're definitely milking that stomp beat here. Some cool fuzz guitar soloing, and McCafferty is still belting out the screams. Definitely more AC/DC here as well. Up next is Gimme What's Mine, with a boogie riff put to an almost tribal beat, but it's got me thinking that this could have easily been covered by a bluesy hair metal band if looking for a mid-paced and calmer track. Kind of dig it, actually. This leads us to Kentucky Fried Blues, which switches between bluesy stomper and power chord rocker, and also punctuated with some awesome screams. After that, we get New York Broken Toy, a mellower bluesy acoustic number with some added electric guitar swagger. Then, like clockwork, we get the usual second ballad from the band with Busted, which is heavy on the blues, and you'd swear it's Steven Tyler singing it when it really isn't. It's also a cover song originally done by Harlan Howard, if that's of interest. And if you wanted yet a third ballad, you quickly get Place in Your Heart, which is pure country western. And we end the record with yet another ballad with All the King's Horses, which, comparatively speaking, is the best of the ballads here. But seriously, 4 ballads on one album, and with 3 of them in a row. Ridiculous. Anyways, favorites are Expect No Mercy and Gimme What's Mine. Also, the album cover art is by Frank Frazetta, who's known for his Conan art and has graced the covers of bands such as Molly Hatchet, Dust, Wolfmother, and even Yngwie J. Malmsteen. As for charting and certification, it reached 82 in the US and 78 in Canada. Speaking of the latter, and as you can imagine, it went gold in Canada yet again. So while it's noticeably heavier than the last 2 albums, I feel they still have a way to go to regain some of that aggression and impact of those earlier records. Even still, the front-loading of heavy tracks on side 1 does save this from falling into the same doldrums of those last 2 records. But man, the ballad overload really brings this record down. Next is their 10th studio album, released in January of 1979 by A&M Records. This is No Mean City. So the band became a 5-piece at this point with the addition of guitarist Zal Clemenson, which many claimed helped heavy up the band from the previous releases. Also, no cover tunes on this one, thank God. The first album to not have one since their second record, Exercises. It's a welcome thing. Anyways, album opens with Just to Get Into It, and yes, it's a strong opener with a solid rock riff and some undeniable punch in the vocals. Stronger gang vocals as well, and a belter of a solo to boot. Shades of the new wave of British heavy metal here, and technically they are British, though obviously too old and too established to qualify. Again, obviously. After that is May the Sunshine, which has a ballad at its base, but interspersed with more rock and guitar work. It does feel like a throwback song, though. I mean, not so much 1979 as maybe 1969, because it's got a little bit of hippie stink on it. Next is Simple Solution, parts 1 and 2, written by the new guy in the band. Guitar tone is a little weak, but the track is decent. McCafferty is the star of the show with his melodic, screamy vocals. Choruses are likewise strong and bring things into the modern era of the late 70s, early 80s heavy rock scene. Then we get the requisite second ballad with Star, though with a bit of vocal punch and moments of power ballad amidst the acoustic passages. Much better than May the Sunshine and about 90% of the ballads they've done up to this point. Following that, we go back to dirty, heavy riffing with Claim to Fame, killer and almost slow headbangable riff with McCafferty belting out full-blown aggressive screams. Next is Whatever You Want, Babe, a kind of boogie, mid-paced ballad, but still maintains some energy, so it doesn't bring the record down at all. Then we get What's In It For Me with its wailing guitar trade-offs, tribal beats, and McCafferty in high raspy mode. Expect some slide guitar on this one as well. The album ends with the title track, which is more boogie riffing and wailing guitars, though the pacing is brought down a touch and McCafferty does get a little crazy as the track progresses, so that's definitely a little bit entertaining. It's an odd but effective album closer. Anyways, favorites are just to get into it, Simple Solution and Claim to Fame. As for charting and certification, it reached 88 in the US and 34 in the UK. Also, Star and Whatever You Want, Babe were the singles. So although they don't qualify as a new wave of British heavy metal band, this album in general would fit well in that scene's heavier offerings. So think a Nawabum-ish version of Nazareth here. Looks like a lot of fans checked out before the release of this album as it didn't even certify, let alone chart as well. Maybe this is their Creatures of the Night, to make a Kiss comparison. Anyways, that lack of attention is a real shame because this is a killer record. Also, that's one serious metal-looking album cover. Second favorite Naz album, for sure. Next up is their 11th studio album released in January of 1980 by A&M Records. This is Malice in Wonderland. So opening track Holiday is a bit of a slow burner and not the usual strong opener. In fact, it's almost a ballad and certainly more polished and radio-friendly. So yeah, strange choice. Next is Showdown at the Border, which sticks in the same AOR direction as the opener, and we're starting to get shades of that early 80s new wave thing going on. And it's probably a good time to mention that the producer is Jeff Baxter, who was in Steely Dan, as well as the Doobie Brothers, and weirdly enough, I feel he's bringing some of that to this album at times. Anyways, next is Talkin' to One of the Boys, which is also a mellow acoustic rocker, except that usual gang vocals here sound a bit less rough and more like something on a Steely Dan record. After this is Hearts Grown Cold, another ballad, and for what it is, it's not that bad. Still has some of that southern appeal from their former ballads. This one's followed by Fast Cars, and yep, that's a vibraphone you're hearing. The bass line over top of it is decent, but this almost lounge club tune just doesn't fit the album or McCafferty's voice. The chorus even gets a bit, say it with me now, Steely Dan. Again, this producer clearly has more of a hand in this record than credited. Anyways, next is Big Boy, and we're back to an acoustic heavy boogie rock track, albeit slow paced. In fact, so far the pace of this album is largely anemic. After this, we get Talkin' 'Bout Love with a more upbeat tempo and riffing, but also some extremely Steely Dan musical elements weaving in and out of an otherwise good riff. Next, we've got Fallen Angel, another ballad that has some moments, but is otherwise forgettable. After that is Ship of Dreams, which is not just acoustic heavy, but very AOR and radio ready, especially if that radio is playing in an elevator. The album ends with Turning a New Leaf, which has a decent riff, but also a strange, splashy snare sound that is way too high in the mix. And again, mellow, AOR, and overall safe. Favorites are Hearts Grown Cold and absolutely nothing else. As for charting and certification, it reached 41 in the US, 19 in Canada, and highest of all in Norway at number 9. Also went gold in Canada, of course. And also, Holiday and Hearts Grown Cold were the singles for this one. Anyways, given that it's 1980, I suppose Nazareth could have gone with a resurgence of heavy metal at the time, and I would have preferred that, but chose to go the easy listening route with some new wave elements in there to boot. Faint hints of the more rockin' version of this band are here, but nowhere near enough to make this a compelling listen. Next is their 12th studio album, released February 6, 1981 by A&M Records. This is the Fool Circle. So opening track Dressed to Kill brings back some of that old-timey rock and roll from earlier in their career, with prominent piano playing underneath a steady and more modern riff. It's an energetic number and certainly stronger than anything on the previous album. It has sort of a Cheap Trick vibe to it. Next is Another Year, which has that mellow rock thing from the last album. Then we get Moonlight Eyes, and it's a piano and acoustic ballad with some strained and often clean vocals. Next is Pop the Silo, and it's clear that the 80s Naz is doubling down on including acoustic guitar in almost everything, including this one. McCafferty does belt out some decent vocals, and the song moves along well. It's fine. Next up is Let Me Be Your Leader, which is where we now get reggae. Yep, it's a reggae riff, a reggae beat, and more or less reggae vocals. Again, odd choices for the era and for the specific band. We Are the People is next, bringing in a boogie bass line along with some southern guitar flavor underneath, but it's just too mellow. After that is Every Young Man's Dream, a light and repetitive acoustic rock with almost a calypso beat and McCafferty's vocals front and center. I could see them playing this on a beach to no one in particular. Next is Little Part of You, and we're definitely getting new wave and early 80s pop here with heavy synths and pulsating beats. McCafferty's usual vocals here are a strange pairing with this. And then totally out of nowhere is a live cover of Cocaine. Yes, that Cocaine. First off, why a live song is the second to the last track on an otherwise studio album? Yet another strange choice. It's a bit reworked, to be fair. It's heavily acoustic and certainly a jam performance, but the crowd really digs it. This might even be the best thing on the album. After that, we end the record with Victoria, which brings in some of the honky-tonk Stones worship, which again, we hadn't heard in a while. Funny that these last two tracks don't fit at all with the rest of the record, and yet they are, by comparison, a welcome surprise. Anyways, favorites are Cocaine and Victoria. There you go. As for charting and certification, it reached 70 in the US, 60 in the UK, 31 in Canada, and highest of all in Norway, again, at number 29. So it's clear that at this point, Nazareth has lost their way in a changing music scene, given the new wave, reggae, and soft rock attempts. This is also when the RIAA certifications end, as well as a drop-off in chart ratings. So let's stop there and get to my conclusions. So here's my album ranking, and I would definitely say that the Nazareth albums that are closest to metal, without technically being metal, are those top two. Hair of the Dog, but maybe more immediately No Means City. I mean, that latter record might be even closer to metal. But I am recommending both here, with those next two right behind it. The other surprise here was how well they did very specifically in Canada and Norway. I mean, I'm not sure why those places, but that's where the band's longest charting runs happen. But they did pretty darn great in America as well. However, only 5 of the 10 records charted at all in the UK, and oddly enough, not Hair of the Dog. I mean, the band's from Scotland, so that's kind of interesting. And speaking of Hair of the Dog, covers from other bands pretty much stop after that album, which makes some sense as it was their biggest hit. Still, can't deny the metal bands that covered Nazareth. I mean, you've got Artillery, Arch, Saxon, Raven, Overkill, Metallica, and Metal Church, just to name some. And of course, Nazareth did plenty of cover tunes of their own, and it's clear that many bands really could take a lesson from them in how to make a cover song their own, because they were pretty damn good at it. Anyways, let's answer the big question, and that's, do I consider the band contributive to heavy metal? Well, you have all of those metal bands covering them, so that's a vote for yes right there. McCafferty had that wailing scream of a voice long before folks like Brian Johnson or Axl Rose or a plethora of other hard rock and metal singers did. Hard to imagine he wasn't intentionally emulated by many. Also, some of those Nazareth album covers, such as those for Hair of the Dog, Expect No Mercy, and No Mean City, are pretty damn metal looking and could have easily fit well with releases from Manowar, Cirith Ungol, or Praying Mantis. So anyways, much of the reason I wanted to do this series is to have an excuse to educate myself, and perhaps you as well, on bands that I might not normally explore, but also might enhance our appreciation of metal, and more specifically, metal history. I like to know things. So if this series illuminates some darker paths on that journey, then mission accomplished. And since this is the first episode of this show, feel free to tell me what you think of the series idea, how you feel about this band and their albums, either mentioned or not. And if you're feeling particularly generous, let me also know what bands you think I should look at next for this series. I'm largely pulling from the 1970s, but maybe the latter half of the 1960s as well, just to give you a bit of a guideline. So yeah, let me know all of that in the comments below. And of course, if this is your first time to my channel and you're wondering what else I do here, my name is Matt. This is the Accusation Network, where each and every week I do videos on metal vinyl collecting, but also classic and modern metal in general. If you liked this video, definitely give it a like, but also subscribe if you haven't already done so. And of course, I always appreciate it if you share my videos with your friends on social media. And of course, thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.